My intention today, and perhaps my task today, is to illustrate what some historians are doing, including me, some of my work, but also share some thoughts about the direction of collaboration between social scientists, historians, and climatologists, in particular paleoclimatologists, both past and perhaps future. So scientists have been, as we know, on the front line of studying greenhouse gases and climate change for decades. The progression in more, let's say, explicitly and clearly stating the role of humans in global warming has been as much a matter of knowledge, the acquisition of more knowledge, but also a matter of politics, as we know from the many the intergovernmental panels on climate change that have been reports that have been issued over the years. And we all know that there's been a battle between climate change deniers and climate change proponents. Now, the human and social sciences have begun also a broad reflection about the present and future of the planet in relation to questions of global warming, essentially from a bit later than the scientists, but pretty soon after the term Anthropocene entered the common lexicon, moved from, let's say, a more specialized geological scientific meaning to a more common, let's say, arena of debate. And the term Anthropocene, of course, is used to address anthropogenic transformations of the Earth system. I'm not going to say too much about how the Anthropocene enters the humanities. Just a couple of citations, of quotations that might illustrate the general trend, perhaps, of the discussion, which has covered philosophical, historical, and literary circles. The engagement of the humanities, let's say, with the term of the Anthropocene ranges from attempts to understand planetary transformations in terms of human crisis, and more generally to make the humanities somewhat relevant to the future of the planet. Now, the impact of humans as a geological force has implications that go far beyond understanding just the role of nature. The future of the planet has been, I think, inextricably connected with human and social behavior. And I mean, Dipesh Chakrabarty is a historian and philosopher who has written already in 2009 about the Anthropocene. Bruno Latour wrote a book a few years ago, and in different ways they both stress how natural and human dimensions have come together, and it's difficult to understand one without the other. As Bruno Latour said, in particular, despite all of the sophistication, the various fields of the humanities, obsessed as they've been with defending the human dimension against the illegitimate encroachment of science and the risk of excessive naturalization, could not detect what the historians of nature have to be credited with bringing to light, that is, the human forcing, let's say, on the Earth system. So in the humanities, we have a debt, I would say. We owe something to the scientists, and something that is also transforming the humanities. However, historians have been engaged with discussions about the role of climate in historical events for a long time. it's not just the Anthropocene that suddenly, we see the light and say, oh, climate is actually important. And perhaps we can go back to the work of Ellsworth Huntington, who is credited with both placing climate changes and especially the use of proxies to reconstruct climate in relation to civilization, human societies, and so on. So he's often reviled as being a geographical determinist, which he certainly was. But at the same time, he did recognize that the responsibility for understanding how societies change was a historian's responsibility, was not the scientist's responsibility or role. Another milestone was reached in 1967 with the publication of the History of Climate after the year 1000 by Leroy-Ladurie, French historian. And regardless of the political intellectual context in which this book came out, we have to say that he had enormous influence, especially because climate was understood by historians as a rather static thing. There was a climate zone, temperate zone, cold zone, arid zone, and so on. Whereas with Leroy-Ladurie, we started to learn that climate changes. And that change over time makes it the object of historical investigation. Yet another, I'm still in this introductory, yet another moment in which historians started to reflect about the role of climate in history came in 1980 with a special issue of the Journal of Interdisciplinary History. And I'm sure you can recognize some people who had an important role in the development of historical climatology. And we are talking about 43 years ago. 43 years ago, and in some ways, this moment which served to set some kind of agenda for historians who were interested in paleoclimatology. And well, of course, there was a call for the rational inclusion of the climatic factor in the study of history. David Fisher wrote that for him the primary objective, the primary goal was to promote a synthesis. And this is when the ice cores from Greenland were being analyzed, when there was a certain greater understanding of climatic changes, but also proxy data and other natural proxies allowed paleoclimatologists to reconstruct climate. And so for Fisher, an important goal was to reach some kind of synthesis to reconstruct climate from different ways of reconstructing it. And of course, the third quotation actually comes from Jan de Vries. And Jan de Vries is an economic historian of the early modern period. He was interested especially in one thing that we are still interested in today, and that is how do we measure the impact of climate on society. So this is a particularly difficult point that he identified a long time ago, and we are still struggling with. This is at the time when, of course, new quantitative methods came into historical research, especially economics, like statistics and so on. So would this quantitative turn, let's say, help us also understand and measure the impact of climatic change? But what kind of history are we really talking about? Because many people have engaged with environmental issues and with natural questions and so on to construct, for instance, so-called big histories that go from the Big Bang to today, and of course are the product of a sort of synthetic thinking where geology and biology and many other disciplines contribute to this long-term history of human evolution and human development. Now, we are really not concerned with this type of large synthesis from, the universe to today, because the human dimension tends to really disappear, or human agency tends really to disappear here. Another type of history that is, related to what I'm going to talk about, but it's less so than one might think, is environmental history. Environmental history specializes on human transformation of the environment, the connections between political and economic history and ecology, for instance. And of course, climate is implicated in this, but not necessarily. What I'm talking about is, and which we will see very soon, is rather the impact of climate on political, social, economic history, not necessarily on the environment, on actual human social changes. One environmental historian, however, John McNeill, a very prominent environmental historian indeed, like several others, has reflected deeply on questions that relate specifically to how historians trying to incorporate climate into their work and their thinking. For instance, how they define historical periods and how they frame questions of continuity or rupture in the evolution of societies and communities. Maybe such fears are a little bit exaggerated for a simple reason, and that is that most of the historians who have embraced what some call a climate turn in historical research publish actually in science journals. This is one of the issues that is still an open question. How much our interest in the impact of climate change on social issues and historical issues can really penetrate the consciousness and the work of the discipline as a whole, because most of the work is actually not represented in historical or journals. Anyway, what we are really talking about here is something rather different, and that is the renewed interest that by historians who specialize in understanding, as I said, social political change, and using climate to trace how natural dynamics may uncover otherwise hidden pressures on social and political systems, for instance, that may in turn explain human events. So the idea is to access this new type of knowledge to uncover what has not been known through traditional sources, traditional historical sources, documents, chronicles, whatever. And in particular, some of, for instance, the so-called 17th century crisis has been studied by a historian for a long time, based on simply political crisis, religious wars, and so on. But for the past 20 or 30 years or so, more and more people have drawn a parallel between the Little Ice Age and the contemporary crisis of different societies across the globe. So it's a planetary or global crisis that is attributed to challenges that many different societies were facing at the same time, although they reacted differently, of course. We have this issue of how a climatic period might have an impact on a large scale on a historical period like the early modern age, for instance. One other two simple premises, or perhaps one premise in two different parts, is also that when we ask when did the Anthropocene begin, there have been many different answers to this simple question. We also are asking something different, I think. We need to know something about human history in order to figure out when human activity began to affect the Earth system. But to do so, we also need to be conscious of a problem that has been debated for a long time in history, namely, the past is not history. These are two separate things. History is a representation of the past based on archival documents and written records, letters, chronicles, whatever. They form the archives of the human past. But the relevance of that information to a general context or background has to be generated or created by a historian. So it's the historian who selects the documents and puts them together in a narrative. And every narrative is ultimately quite subjective. So the past is something, and history is a reflection or representation of the past. And I think the same problem is for climate. Paleoclimatology is not the past climate. Is a representation of the past based on an interpretation of the data that are collected, examined, and in very different ways with different definitions, different resolutions, and serving different purposes, and so forth. So, one interesting thing about history and paleoclimatologists is that the result of our research is still subject to interpretation, and in both cases, and which seems to be obvious, but I think that joining together our interpretation, we can get a better sense of a better explanation of events on both sides. So I will not go into the difference between narration and explanation, but I think it's important when we talk about the Anthropocene to recognize that science and history are ultimately pursuing a common task. A common task and need to develop methods that are compatible with each other. And that is the main challenge today, this search for a compatibility between paleoclimate research and historical research. This is where we are, this is what some of us are looking for, and these collaborations are important. So as we look for compatibility, we are really in an experimental phase. And there are many different experiments, mushrooming, let's say, here and there, different groups like the one with Jörg and Elena and many others groups. I participated in various groups. The objective here, we can call it an archipelagus of empirical approaches pursued by different people and different groups. And they are very dependent on these experiments of a number of things, such as team composition, who is the member of the team? What kind of expertise are we trying to put together? Do we get, besides the paleoclimatologist and the historian, we get also the archaeologist, maybe the ecologist, the environmental specialist, the geologist, and so forth. Palynologist, paleobotanic specialist. And of course, we are trying to bring together all the type of expertise that can help us solve a problem. Usually at the source of this, there is also a research design, which I put as number 3, but actually it should be perhaps number 1 here. And it's also very dependent on available data and available sources. I work typically on a history that is very poor in documentation, very poor. Because unfortunately, nomadic people in history have left very few documents. And the documents have been usually written by their victims, so they need to be interpreted in some ways. And therefore, my own brand of history is already interdisciplinary. We rely a lot on archaeology, so material culture, and also anthropological studies, because nomadic societies work in a certain way. But nevertheless, we do have some data, and other people work in other regions which are much more data intensive, I guess, or source intensive. The research design is critical, I would say, as we sometimes apply for grants, and the research design really needs to be very carefully crafted in defining the goals of the project, and research questions at the heart of it. And then we have research methods, and research methods come from different disciplines, of course, and sometimes they are not that compatible, actually. So it's a mishmash sometimes of different methods. And each one of these points presents challenges. So what we try to do is, really more art than science in some ways, putting together all of this information. But I personally think that the objective, the goal of the research design, trying to come up with a good explanation or a good answer to a question that we pose, a historical question, is really critical. So as I was saying before, most of these experiments or the product of these experiments, as I should say, are published in science journals. And this has both advantages and disadvantages. I would say it has some advantages because it socializes the historian in a way to collaborate and communicate with scientists. So we learn the language, the style, the way of presenting data. I remember that I find it very challenging to do some graphs, for instance, to understand graphs. So that is a challenge. On the other hand, the disadvantage here is it risks alienating most other historians who don't read, don't have to read, in fact, these publications. So it creates a kind of a sort of clique or faction or group of people that consider themselves somewhat separate from. But there are efforts, of course, to publish articles in both science journals and historical journals. It's just that it's very time-consuming and not very common. So one of the critical questions is what can climate research contribute to history, and what new historical perspectives are emerging as a consequence. I mean, this is a very broad question, of course. And this is at the heart of my talk today, trying to identify the value of these collaborations. What are we trying, in really practical terms, to get out of the efforts that we put in collaborating, which are, there must be a reward somewhere, right? Because otherwise there is no point in doing it. So I've identified, let's say 4, but it could be this list of types of knowledge that could be gained from this exercise could be changed. One is, what we can get from climate studies is information that we cannot get anywhere else. That is one of the first points about accessing these data sets from laboratory sciences. Oops, sorry. Oh no, here we are. So the second point, or the second type of knowledge we can get is new research directions based on climate data, which I call data-driven. In other words, some paleoclimatological reconstruction or simulation or modeling comes up with some information that the historians say, oh, I didn't expect that. Let's investigate. Maybe we can get some answers to questions that have not been raised before. The third one is, asking historical questions that have never been solved before, so we start with the historical question rather than the data part, and say, well, maybe we can get new knowledge from the climate. I mean, let's reconstruct the climate and see whether that effort, let's understand the climate, that effort pays off by providing new answers to old questions or to questions that have never been answered satisfactorily. And then a lot of cases I've added as a fourth type, a lot of cases just suggest the possibility, by establishing correlations between some climate anomalies, climate shocks, and historical events, suggest that there might be a connection between the two, and to be then further explored later. So these are some ways. I mean, I'm not saying that this is an exhaustive list, but some ways in which historians and climatologists have collaborated. Now, let's have a look at the first type. The first type is very interesting because I'm now presenting some cases that I find useful to illustrate these 4 types. So the first one, yes, information that cannot be obtained elsewhere. I don't know if you know this study, but it's about a Viking settlement in North America, in Newfoundland, in Canada. It's called Lanso Meadow, and it was established by the Vikings during the Viking era. So it's like 400 years. It's located here, as you can see, the red spot. Not far from Greenland. I've not been to this place, but I would like to go. Apparently, these long Viking houses have all been reconstructed, and because there were logs there and left by the Vikings, more than 150 carbon-14 dates have been recovered, but they all have a chronological range. So we didn't know exactly the date of this, when the Vikings discovered America. When was it? So what the contribution of climatology here is very interesting because carbon-14 varies. Solar radiations vary, and there are spikes. They can be detected in the tree rings. So one such spike was, which happened worldwide, is identified with the year 993, CE AD 993. So once that particular ring was identified, where the carbon-14 was much higher than in other rings, it was just a matter of counting the rings to the edge of the log, which had been cut by a metal axe that only the Vikings had in that region. So it was certain that it was the Vikings who cut felled the tree, and not some other people. And by this method, the date was identified as 1021. So for historians, this dating could have is equivalent to any other date that could be drawn from a letter or a document or a map or anything else. So it's a precise date that, however, we would not know without the climate knowledge that produced this date. So here we have a clear example of new knowledge of historical value produced by climate scientists. And it's a very simple but very clear way of accessing this knowledge. Type 2, I have to refer to one of my articles in collaboration with many climatologists, all of them working in Mongolia, and this is the second type when historical questions are raised by climatic data. So, this is the historical context may be very foreign to people here and online. This is the Uyghur Empire. The Uyghur Empire is an empire in Mongolia. They are the forerunners, if you like, the ancestors of the Mongols. A few hundred years before. This empire lasted maybe 100 years, from 744 to 840, as you can see there. And for most of this period, let's say for the second half of this period, from 783 to 844, there was a long-lasting drought, the longest and deepest and most severe drought in the whole climate history of Mongolia. So this raised the question, how did this empire survive for such a long time under such severe climatic pressures, or environmental, I should say, environmental pressures? As you can see on the right, we have the climate reconstruction, and perhaps you can see also here the difference between the first period of this Uyghur Empire, between 743 and 782. The green is, maybe I can point this here. Yes, the green here is indicates a wetter period. Later on, in the second half of this period, from 783 to 844, you can see that a lot of the green turns brown, which indicates drier conditions. So, typically, when you have a situation of a very, very long drought, people would say, well, this is a push factor. People would migrate, leave that area because it cannot be sustainable. And that has been the persuasion of a lot of people, a lot of historians who attributed conquests, wars, migrations to droughts, for instance, because it was difficult to. Whereas we found that this empire continued to prosper more or less for many decades. So there were no migrations, there was no collapse, there was no end of the empire. So what we saw, however, was an internal transformation of their economy, with a greater diversification from just pastoral production to trade, for instance, supplementing the revenues, some imports of agricultural products from the south, tribute relations with their neighbors, and also other phenomena that surprised us, such as urbanization. There's a large capital and so on. In other words, not to emphasize any one of these particular differences, but here we have let's say, nomadic pastoral empire that is very different from the previous ones. So the question is, perhaps the environmental pressure forced them to change their way to do things, move away from their pastoral path dependency, and move and find new solutions. Possibly, this is a hypothesis. We don't know for sure, but we see clearly that it's behaving differently from other empires, and therefore we have also. It's also interesting, for instance, that there is a reduction of conflict and war in this period. So environmental stress does not produce more wars and more conquests, rather more peace agreements. And I think these type of examples may be useful today, as because we are quick to sometimes decide that environmental stress produces war, migrations, or conflict, all sorts of things, whereas historical examples may give us a different view of human adaptation. Another example, a little bit more complicated, again, my research, and this was an article that we produced with two climatologists, Ulf Björntgen and Sebastian Wagner, and was published in a German journal, Erdkunde, not a long time ago, a couple of years ago. And this was a very strange case study, which referred to a battle that the Mongols lost. Now, you might say, well, what's the importance of a single battle that the Mongols lost? Well, the Mongols had not lost any battle until then. That is the first point. And also, by losing that battle, they also lost Syria and Egypt in the process. So the Mongol Empire could have easily extended from Iraq, that they conquered Baghdad in 1258, all the way to Syria, that they had already occupied, and Egypt. But having lost that battle, they lost. So it's in world history has a certain importance. The whole Christian and Islamic world would have been completely changed by that that battle if the Mongols had won. So Hulegu was the head of the Mongol army, was the brother of the great Khan. Anyway, what was interesting about this case and what stimulated our interest is the connection between this campaign, which started in 1254 but proceeded slowly, with the eruption of the Samalas volcano. So this is the greatest, the largest eruption in, 2,000 years? in the past 2,000 years, possibly, and you can see a comparison on the right between among the different eruptions, Samalas, Tambora, Krakatoa, Pinatubo, and the Vesuvius. And Samalas looks much bigger than any other. So clearly it had a global impact, and our question was, our curiosity was stimulated by the possibility that the climatic changes that can be associated with the volcanic eruption might have conditioned in some ways the outcome of this political military campaign by the Mongols. So this again is an experiment. Don't forget that we are still in this experimental phase. So what are the general effects of the Samalas eruption in that region? We are talking about the Middle East. So I appreciate, although I cannot reproduce it, I appreciate that there is regional differences in the way that volcanic eruption modify the climate. So in that particular region, we found, that lower temperatures, which is a common outcome, but also more abundant precipitations, occurred in the years after the eruption, so 1258, 1259, and maybe into 1260. So longer rainy season, lower temperatures, environmental change, reduction in aridity, possibly longer growing season for the period right after the eruption. All of this seemed to indicate that the northern part of Syria, which is steppe, is grassland, so south of Anatolia, the Euphrates and so on, could have experienced greater grass production. Is even today a pastoral region. Greater grass, so a greening, let's say a greening of northern Syria. And here we go to the historical thinking, or the historical sources. Actually, we have a letter, which is rare, but we have a letter by the head of the Mongol expedition to the King of France, saying, we've conquered Syria, but we had to leave because the whole pasture the grass had been exhausted. So the pasture has been exhausted. Why? Because they brought a very large army into that region. And why did they bring the large army into that region? Because they could. Because they could, since the pasture land was more abundant. So this is the question that we raised. Yeah, okay, they could conquer Syria, but then they had to leave. They had to leave because they had exhausted all the grass. You have to think, in terms of how many horses came into Syria. Probably 120,000. So it's a lot of horses. It's clear that they could. And here we see the reconstructed climate based on proxy data, which shows a very clear peak of rainfall coinciding with lower temperatures for the years 1250 to 1260. Here we have simulated temperature and precipitation anomalies, again showing here we have the simulated simulation of temperatures and precipitation, showing lower temperatures and greater precipitations in the years 1258 to 1260. So in the end, we came to the conclusion that actually the Mongols could move the whole army into Syria because they had enough pasture, but then they had to withdraw because the pasture was exhausted by the elevated number of horses. They left insufficient manpower, insufficient soldiers in Syria, maybe thinking that they were not going to be attacked, but they were attacked because, of course, when you leave few soldiers, your enemies are emboldened and they prepare an army, and so they lost. This is the Battle of Ain Jalut, and they lost the whole country, Syria, and they could not invade Egypt. And at that point, the Mamluks, who conquered this region, and Mongols in Iran and Iraq stayed as enemies, let's say, for 100 years, or maybe 80 years. But the Mongols were never able to reconquer this region. So this is just an example of historical thinking influenced by climatic data. Nobody had been able to actually give an explanation as to why the Mongols lost. Some people said, well, their horses were tired, but we don't really have. The fourth case, the fourth type that they've suggested, I'm really not. I want to go very quickly over this. Just as simple examples of correlations between climatic events and historical events that people have put together, suggesting a causal relationship, that the climate, and one has been, for instance, the large droughts in the ancient Near East, and the collapse of the Akkadian Empire proposed by Harvey Weiss many years ago. This again, we have a drought, we have a collapse of an empire. Can the two be put together? Of course, there is a lot of archaeological research that goes into this, and the question is, what is a collapse? And a number of historians have quite rightly, like John Haldon, for instance, who I think he's listening to us, have quite rightly contested this term collapse, because in fact we have to consider also continuity, resilience, transformation. And so collapsing everything in the single word, collapse, is not necessarily the best way of representing a historical phenomenon. Another case is, which has been quite, which has been, has attracted a lot of attention, is the correlation between volcanic eruption and lowering of temperatures that suppressed the floods of the Nile. As you know, the fertility of the land was caused by these periodic floods that essentially fertilized the land, and where there were no floods, then the land became less productive, so fewer harvests, so perhaps famines and rebellions in Egypt. So there is a causal chain, let's say, that can be attributed to a climate forcing by volcanic. This is something that we need to consider, as a possible factor in altering the relationship between natural resources and socio-political stability. But again, we are talking about a correlative structure, a correlational structure that perhaps requires also some additional investigation into the social and political events that were taking place. So this is, again, what I just said, actually. And finally, a paper that has been discussed quite a bit, and even though it was published in a science journal, even historians reacted to this paper because they felt that it's not enough to simply look at an eruption, although it was a big eruption of the volcano, to explain what was going on in Rome, that is a civil war in following the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC. And so here again, the question is, okay, we have all of these scientific data. We have all of these scientific data, climate data from Greenland ice cores and caves, speleothems and dendro records and so on. Do they amount to something that can be construed as a cause, an historical agent as a cause? So this is something that actually we need to take with a certain amount of caution, of course. We need to see how the climate elements are acting upon a certain socio-political configuration. And we cannot dismiss out of hand the possibility that a lowering of temperature producing maybe famines and rebellion might have exacerbated, might have made a critical situation worse. So most historians tend to think that a climate element, a climate worsening, let's say a climate shock, makes a crisis into something worse, maybe a catastrophe, right? And so as an accelerating impact on certain dynamics. So, but again, most historians would reject any kind of monocausal, single cause argument, and so that's what we need to be careful about. We need to be careful about. Looking at climate is one thing, but we cannot attribute everything to climatic changes. And some people even say, it's a correlation, it's just a coincidence. Things happening at the same time that don't need to be one the cause or another. And in fact, another article on speaking of climate forcing shows that even a large eruption like that of this Mount Churchill in Alaska in 852, 853, had very different effects and very different impacts in different regions of the world. In some cases, like China, there was no effect whatsoever. So the regional dimension, let's say, of the climatic impact becomes more and more important. So we have a planetary event, but then we have regional responses to this event that need to be examined so the importance of regional climate models perhaps is critical. So now I'm almost done, and where are we now? I mean, this is I'm trying to sum up something that I probably should not be summing up because everything is still so open that I don't want to limit anything. But, most collaborations between historians and climate scientists are, for at least the ones to which I have participated, have been ad hoc collaborations linked to a particular project or a particular question that we wanted to investigate. And we have this growing number of experiments and growing number of publications. But I think it is really difficult to move beyond a certain experimental level, and all of these publications, one way or another, are subject to some criticism, especially by certain historians. So we have we have to balance, I think, the pros and the cons. I mean, we still have certain obstacles to collaboration. We are still dealing with disciplines that are not immediately intelligible to each other. So there's a mutual unintelligibility. We have separate realms of research, publications, really a different culture in a way of producing knowledge. The scales of research and associated design questions are very different. Historians work by themselves, typically, and they're not socialized in working in groups, so they have to learn also the etiquette of that. And often there is insufficient institutional support and recognition for collaborative projects. This is really critical, I think. Funding agencies and institutions and so on do not really recognize these collaborations as being important. There are incentives, though. I mean, it's not as if we are like Don Quixote, fighting against windmills. The pressing issues of our own time, I think, require, as I said in the beginning, greater cooperations among different areas of knowledge. We cannot discuss the Anthropocene without also having a broader historical view of the human dimension of it. Multiple data sets can raise new questions. So it's also for each discipline is important because it can advance your own knowledge in that discipline, not just in terms of collaborative research. And what are the possible outcomes of these collaborations? Well, maybe we can get more open and perhaps better research structures at the institutional level, research settings. Maybe we can come up with a higher theoretical and more sophisticated view of how different epistemologies can combine, can come together. And new research paradigms may provide new insights and solutions in terms of natural human interaction. New solutions may also be tested and adopted to prevent or limit societal failures in the future. Maybe, maybe not. I'm not that optimistic about that. So, concluding thoughts, and now I'm really done. What are the future directions beyond the experimental? I just said before, well, we have to continue with looking for common ground and more and mutual intelligibility. How do we do that? Well, simply by continuing to do what we are doing. I mean, by collaborating, publishing together, communicating. But also we need greater theoretical sophistication. We need to focus more on theoretical problems. What do we mean by causality? This is critical in history. How do we produce models? I mean, how do we use models for research? What do we mean by synthesis of different types of evidence? How does a climatic evidence and historical evidence can be brought together at the same level, and so on. So this is also can we ever produce an Anthropocenic lab in the future where we have institutions that actually invest in that collaborative enterprise, in that collaborative effort? I don't know whether this is possible or not, but I think in terms of future objectives, if we think that Anthropocene is important, is something that is relevant to our future, then maybe an Anthropocenic lab would be where research should be conducted. Thank you very much, and I'm finished. Thank you for listening.